Technique must be acquired, and with technique, a love of the very process of cooking. No artist can work simply for results. He must also like the work of getting them.
I highlighted that one too.
Yeah, I just think that, yes, there are going to be really great days in homeschooling, and yes, there's going to be some ordinary days, but liking what we are doing really does matter.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-hosts today are Pam Barnhill, Misty Winkler, and Abby Wall. Pam is a speaker, podcaster, blogger at pambarnhill.com, and author of 2 fabulous books, Better Together and Plan Your Year. Misty is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 1 graduate. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of The Convivial Homeschool, Gospel Encouragement for Keeping Your Sanity While Living and Learning Alongside Your Kids, now available on Amazon. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé Sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Quick announcement, if you are not in the Sistership, you are really missing out. The 2021 Sophie Christmas gift came out this week. It's a Plutarch resource you will not want to miss. The annual gift is only available until January 6th, so go grab yours ASAP. Also, we'll be giving away the prizes for 5x5 challenge finishers soon, so watch for instructions on how to get that. I mean, listen, there is so much I could say. Why don't you just head on over to scholésisters.com/sistership and join us? Today is our annual so-called Christmas episode and the least Christmassy one we've ever done. Oops. But no matter, we were all together in Idaho and recorded this conversation inspired by chapter 3 of the book The Supper of the Lamb. It might not be super Christmassy, but I like to think this episode is a gift nonetheless. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé every day. Who would like to go first?
This is Abby, and I would love to go first. Okay. This past morning time rotation, we have been including Bob Schultz's Practical Happiness, and we have read many of his books before because they're geared towards boys, but I have found so much insight and wisdom, and it's a great way to talk about tougher subjects that maybe I as a mother would want to moralize or lecture, which I'm trying to get away from. And I don't have to do that because these books present such ideas in a way that is palatable to all people. So I have been really enjoying going through this book with all my kids.
My 11-year-old right now, I've assigned part of his reading is his book, Bob Schultz's book, Created for Work.
Yes, we love that one
And
too.
it is that, like, because he goes through stories that are enjoyable and they're not, they're a real life story. He's like sharing his personal experience. So it's not like you should do this or that. It's like in the context.
Micro in book form. The
Dirty Jobs
guide.
Yeah. Yes.
Nice.
Yeah.
And he uses scripture and principles, but not in an overly, if you do this, then this will happen way. It's just very much applicable and the application of the heart and getting to the heart of boys. But I also will just often say boys and girls because my daughter is also in our morning time. And she enjoys it as well. It's good for everyone.
I loved it. I read it for myself first.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
It's really good. Well, I will go next.
All right.
This is Misty, and I am reading Herman Bavinck's slim little volume, Christian Worldview. So
interesting.
He has a couple like systematic theology tomes.
Yeah. We're doing Wonderful Works of God right now.
Yeah, I own that. But this seemed like a little bit less of a commitment to
For sure.
just test out a little Bavinck. So it's translated from the Dutch, and he wrote it in the very early 1900s, but it was just translated like 5 or 7 years ago. So it's very readable. The translation is very readable. And I wasn't sure if this would go in my theology category or my philosophy category for my 5x5 challenge. I also think that I can finish this in a reasonable amount of time. So I think I'm going to fit it into whichever category needs the next.
Nice. I like it.
But it is good. The introduction was helpful with just the term worldview. So Bavinck and Kuyper and a couple of those other European Reformed writers at the turn of the 19th century were trying to answer modernism and came up with this term, or, it was a German term originally, but it's been overused a lot since then. So it's kind of interesting. And so it's kind of fell out of favor more recently, but it was super big in the homeschooling circles when I was growing up. So it's a little bit interesting to see. This is like the beginning of when it was a new cool word that he's trying to flesh out.
Interesting.
Oh, this is Pam. And I am actually using our morning hike as my skole every day. So Abby drugged me out into the cold this morning.
It was 37 degrees. We'll take that.
Okay, that's really cold at my house.
Yeah.
That's really cold.
Dead of winter.
Actually, I wouldn't have thought it was 37. I would have thought it was warmer than that. So
Which is why I told Dawn not to tell you how cold it was.
And then we went hiking up hills. And my knees may never be the same again.
Oh, sad.
But the views were absolutely beautiful on the lake in Idaho. And everything was so pretty. And I was able to keep up. And we saw turkeys.
Turkeys.
Yeah, there were turkeys. Wild turkeys. Yeah, it was beautiful. It was very beautiful. And good conversation.
Which made the 2.5 miles seem manageable.
Yeah, seemed like only 2 miles.
I know, we talked productivity apps.
Yeah, we did. We talked other things too.
Yes, we did.
You guys. Okay, so this is Brandy, and mine is one of the numerous books that Misty mailed to my house over the last few months. So as we were preparing for the fall retreat, Misty went on some sort of buying spree. It was so nice to have someone on a buying spree who wasn't me, and yet the books came to my house.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think sometimes Sai would open the mail and another one? Why are you buying all these books? And I'm like, I'm not buying them. Misty's buying them. And so I didn't even get in trouble.
The Scholay sisters is buying them.
I'm going to let him connect those dots. So, we don't want to do all the work for our students.
Yeah.
So we had assigned reading for preparation for the retreat in Mary Carruthers' Book of Memory. And this book has been on my list to buy for, I think since before my youngest child was even born. It's just been on my list forever. And it's always been the kind of book where I didn't have a good excuse to buy it. Mm-hmm. And it's on the pricier side.
It is pretty spendy.
And so it just kind of felt like, I'm okay buying a more expensive book if there's a really good reason for it, but I never had the compelling reason to buy it.
You're welcome.
That's why we did this.
Really very thankful that you built my library. No, I don't know what I expected from it, but I've really liked it. One of the things I'm bringing up at the retreat, but I'm going to bring up here because I just love the idea. Let me find it here. Oh, it's the idea of ethical truths. This was so interesting to me. So it's like when we have a definition of something that's more abstract, like courage or what she gives a couple of fortitude, justice, temperance are the examples that she gives. It's not like we really memorize a stock definition that you'd find in the dictionary. I mean, to the point where like if someone walks up and asks you, well, what is justice? It'd really take a while for you to think about it, but you know it when you see it.
Yeah.
And she really just goes into explaining why. And she says, inside of your memory, ethical truths are expressed not singly, but copiously. And basically she's saying what we really have to define those things is this collection of exemplary stories. So like for justice, you have built up over your lifetime a whole bunch of stories that express justice in some way. And you build this composite understanding of justice based upon all of those stories. I loved it because I think I instinctively knew that that's what was going on when we were reading aloud to our kids when they were little and when we're reading novels for ourselves when we're older and reading history and all that stuff. But more than that, it made me realize why some people's definitions seem so lacking. And I think it's because it's been studied as an abstract academic subject. And they don't have that storehouse full of stories to draw on. And so that's why there seems to be this disconnect between what they say justice is and how they really understand it in the real world. Because we're not drawing on stock definitions, actually, when we're functioning in the real world. We're drawing on those stories. So it just really, I mean, for me, even just recentered me in this sense of like, when we spend time on good, excellent stories over all these years, that really is a good use of our time, even in ways that we don't think about like this. And she's got all sorts of little gems like that throughout the whole thing. And I'm only on chapter, 4. So I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it. It's a big book, which does make you feel better about the price.
Yeah.
Like I hate it when you buy an expensive book and you get it and you're like, it's 120 pages. Why is this $45? So this, at least you feel like you kind of got what you paid for.
I have no idea how much it costs. I haven't even looked.
I can't remember. I mean, you might remember.
It's in the 30s.
Okay. Yeah.
35.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's not horrible, but it's just like, for a paper.
It's no norms and nobility.
It's right. Nothing is. But my norms and nobility didn't cost less than it cost less than $30. And it's hardbound.
Just brag.
So,
just brag some more.
I am.
About
Right now, I'm bragging.
Your book pride. Here.
So I told my husband, if we ever have to flee the state, what's coming with us are these irreplaceable books. I mean, we can buy new furniture, but you can't replace your library. Not if it was done right the first time. So
that's a big getaway bag.
Yeah.
Bug out bag.
We might need a trailer.
A bookmobile.
Yeah. That's true. I'm going as fast as I can.
Hi, Abby here to give you an inside look into the community we call the Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to gather and engage in meaningful and fruitful conversation. If you've ever found yourself listening to the podcast and wanting to join the conversation, discuss the ideas presented, or ask a question, then join us inside Sistership. That is where we go in depth and extend the conversation to include all of you. We are passionate about reclaiming and pursuing our own education, and we know that real education happens best in community. Sistership is the place to find your sisters. We have a feature that allows you to search for people near you. We want homeschooling moms to connect locally, and Sistership is here to help. We are fond of saying that friends don't let friends read alone, and we have an active and engaged online community if people in your local area haven't joined yet. Together, we read widely, think deeply, and apply faithfully the educational philosophy and good and great books. So join today.
All right, so today we're doing our Christmas episode, our annual Christmas episode recording at our retreat, and we're discussing chapter 3. Yes, okay, I was right. Supper of the Lamb by Robert Farrar Capon, or is it Capon? Capon?
I don't know.
I actually don't know. Do you know?
Sounds like Capone would have an E.
Yeah, I think
it's that's true.
Capon.
Capon. Mm-hmm.
Great.
Capon.
So we don't know how to say his name. And nobody researched it before right now. But you're right. Capone probably would have an E. So I'm wrong. Anyway, we're discussing this book. It's good. You should read it. And we're discussing food and feasting
as a metaphor for education. And Misty, you wrote our thesis statement. So would you like to get us started?
Well, I thought this chapter was interesting because we do use the metaphor of eating and feasting for education. And I do think it's one of the best education metaphors and most useful. But then in this chapter, I've always said, just Capon.
Do it. Say it with conviction. We're good.
Capon has this different category that goes along with feasting, because not all of your eating is feasting. He is developing this category of cooking and eating that he calls not feral.
But it looks like feral. It's ferial, right?
Ferial,
Ferial. A word none of us had heard before.
Mm-hmm. But it basically means ordinary or everyday cooking and eating. And he talks about how you need both of them.
Like, can we rename it Skole Ferial? It's like something I really can't remember. Okay, sorry. Go on.
It just got me thinking about how we talk a lot, or Charlotte Mason talks a lot anyway, about spreading the feast.
Mm-hmm.
And do we ever maybe put ourselves in a bind or in overwhelm mode because we feel like we have to be in feasting festival mode every moment of every school day? Or how does this category of everyday eating correlate to our educational efforts, where it really sets off? You need both. And the everyday ordinary fare is not worth less or second class. It's all a part of education and just as worthwhile. And so I was trying to make some connections there with those different categories and think of what would feasting look like if we were using these two categories, and what would the everyday ordinary ferial education look like, and how can we be sure that we do both and value both? Because he says in here that both are concerned with excellence. So it's not a different quality. It's just a different almost priority, a different expense.
Yeah.
He talks about expense as in, the festival eating is expensive eating.
Yeah, that's true.
And so you do the everyday eating to stretch it out.
Yeah.
What would be the metaphorical corollary in education?
Well, I was thinking, so on page 27, he says, life is so much more than occasions, and its grand ordinariness must never go unsavored. And the idea of grand ordinariness stood out to me, because I think in a Charlotte Mason education, when we're talking about the feast, she's not talking about fancy, and she's really not that fancy. But I think some people walk away thinking it's fancy to the point where I see on Facebook, well, what can I add to this to make it more? And really the question is, how can I make this fancier? Because just reading it and narrating it and discussing it a little bit and moving on doesn't feel like enough. It doesn't feel like feasting. But I think what she's saying is we're really, when you look at how she works it out, she's saying, well, just because you think child X isn't interested in mashed potatoes doesn't mean you don't put mashed potatoes on the table and see what happens. So it's more like this idea of generosity. All children, regardless of their interests, regardless of their perceived IQ level or capability or whatever, they all come to the same table. We are not changing the meal based on the child. It's not really fanciness. So then when we couple that idea with her idea of you have set school hours and you have a schedule and you have these things that you do with regularity, and it's going to fit in that. And you're not, because I think I bloat the curriculum sometimes because I'm like, this is good and this is good. And maybe they won't notice if I start throwing all this stuff into our day in addition to the very decent curriculum that we already have. To me, that's when I'm going into what you're talking about with feasting mode. I'm way overdoing it. And that doesn't fit into grand ordinariness. And actually what I've just done is stressed everybody out. Which, Christmas can be stressful. We've talked about that before. But it's it is true. At Christmas time, I'm okay with making one more batch of cookies and one more batch of fudge and one more, because it's feasting time. But when I start doing that to the homeschool schedule, I really just left them no personal time. I've overwhelmed and then stressed them out. I took away from what was grand ordinariness. We were just doing the dailiness, and that was good enough. That was the first thing that came to my mind.
So I've been thinking about this, and one of the ideas is that feasting in our homeschool can also seem just like a really great day where things just go smoothly. We are focused. We're paying attention. The narrations are good. Everyone's attitudes is pretty great. The subjects that we're talking about just seem to connect with one another, right? Like it's a day that is actually really great. But that doesn't always happen. And there are very ordinary days where there's a lot of eye rolling, people having to be chased down and be like, no, actually it's time for school, not Legos.
Right.
And there's a lot of times where it's like, what is this? Is this a sentence? And that's a very much a part of those things. Like you cannot have a great day every day. You can have really great ordinary days that where, yeah, okay, I got one really great narration and then a few others that were like, really? Or lots of interruptions in other people's narrations, which we're working on. But I think that sometimes a great day too, like a feast, can have a lot more variety. When I think of preparing a big meal, usually there's lots of sides as well and a lot of different interesting things. So that way you can kind of pick and choose what's really good. Whereas in ordinary, it might be a big thing of soup and there's like, well, there's onions in this and I don't want to eat it, right? Like, or I don't want to do math today. Like, it's these things. So I've thought you can't have a great day every day, but they are still getting nourishment from those ordinary days that are not.
Yeah. Well, and maybe that's part of what he's saying too, right? Is that we turn to non-nourishing foods because we've lost the art of being able to do these simple nourishing meals that actually are really, they're healthy and they're satisfying and they bring you into the next day, ready to face the next day. And we don't have a place for that anymore. So we either do the feast or we do like junk food is kind of where he was writing this in the 60s. I don't think it's really any different now. Not really. I mean, because in reading this book, I was like, I need to get better at that kind of cooking. Because I think I just kind of swing back and forth between like sort of junky food, like hot dogs or something. And then I swing back into, here's a big chunk of meat with like vegetables and starch.
Well, he says, if you feast every day, you don't actually appreciate even the feast.
Right.
You need mostly ordinary days for the feast to be special, appreciated.
Which is unreasonable to expect every day to feel like a triumph.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the church calendar, you have your Lenten season, your Advent season, you have your feast days of Easter and Christmas and all of that stuff. But the rest of the time is called ordinary time. So, it's that same thing. If you're always feasting, you have to have the non-feast days. You have to have just your ordinary days, which are really not ordinary. They're not meant to be not special.
Right.
They're still, we're still diving into the gospel on those days. There's still, good things happening on those days. They're just not those feast days.
Yeah. It's also not, it doesn't mean boring.
Right.
I think that's why I liked his term grand ordinariness, because it was just this appreciation for the regular thing. Well, and I was thinking about how, like, maybe this even relates to this idea of we have this tendency to look around and be like, oh, I need to go there and see that beautiful thing. And I need to go. But when you grow eyes to just see the little things in your neighborhood, and even if you live in like a desert, there's certain beautiful things, certain times of year, or interesting things, certain times of year. That's the same kind of thing. It's like this learned appreciation for just the little things, really.
I kind of had the thought about, you hear moms talk sometimes about, I've got to make it fun. I've got to make it special. I've got to do something interesting all the time. It's always got to be like, here's the lesson and then here's just a little more. And, if I make it just a little more, I'm going to hold their interest. It's going to be something that they're more excited about.
Or that expectation of a magical childhood.
Yes.
I've heard that phrase thrown around
Or
a lot.
that wonder is, we talk about wonder not necessarily being a noun, but being a verb. Like to do, like you need to wonder at things, not necessarily like be filled with awe. And every single thing. That's not what wonder is.
Yeah.
So, and I love, he said in here, he talked about economy. The reason for the distinction between the festal and the ferial is the economy.
Yeah.
And when you think about economy, you're not necessarily talking about a monetary economy when it comes to homeschooling, though there is that. I mean, like we could feast all the time. I could take my kids on a world trip and, if we had the money to do it. But for homeschool moms, I think it's an economy of time, quite honestly.
Yeah.
It's
and energy.
Yeah. Time and energy. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you'd burn your kids out too.
Yeah. Well, and do we want to train them to have that level of stimulation in order to feel appreciation on the inside? I mean, my normal adult experience is that most days are ordinary. And every once in a while, a day is really cool or interesting or special in some way or whatever. And that's life. So then if we're preparing them for real life in one sense, then are we preparing their expectations if we've made it where everything has to be over the top good and amazing? And
there's a quote for that.
Okay, go for it.
On page 23, he says, she's found that her family would eat a whole leg of mutton as readily as a half and with very little additional gratitude. I don't know about you, but I put together the fun lesson and nobody cared but me.
I did love the way it went on too. Like, accordingly, she cooked the leg in 2 installments, seasoned it highly, sauced it liberally, and advised them to keep the gratitude coming unless perhaps they would like her to try quartering it.
Suck it up, Buttercup.
That's right. A man can do worse than be poor. He can miss altogether the sight of the greatness of small things. I'm wondering if some of the pressure we put on ourselves, like what you were talking about, to add, and I mentioned that too, like add the next project, add the next thing. What can I do to make this more than it is just by itself? I wonder if some of that has how we were all raised and the culture we were all raised in. So we weren't really given the sight of the greatness of small things. And so then we can't see it. We underestimate what's happening when a child's just sitting there with a book lost in thought. That's not enough for us. We can't see what's going on. We can't measure that. There's no paperwork produced at the end that we can show somebody else to validate what happened that day. And all of that conspires against us because we're not comfortable with that.
Well, one of the great quotes here, my favorite in the chapter, is he says, a good ferial cook, like a judo expert, always keeps her opponents off balance. She's all confidence and bold response. Her only real enemy is self-doubt.
What page was that on?
Page 24. And of course, this would be the students who are maybe complaining about the fare.
Once you have regained the upper hand, however, be gracious. Offer them a drop of your sherry.
Note, we're not advocating alcohol to children.
If in doubt, spike the water bottles.
Maybe, yeah.
Now, some mornings I do share my coffee.
Nice.
And I think we see this so often with homeschool moms is there is a lot of self-doubt in places that there honestly doesn't need to be.
Yeah.
I talk to moms often who they really have a fabulous plan. And I think on some level, they know that what they're doing is good or what they're doing is fine, but they're seeking some kind of approval for that.
Yeah.
Like if you're at the convention and you're talking to moms in the booth and you're like, this is really great. What you're doing is wonderful.
Yeah.
They just need somebody to tell them that. If we maybe build our skills as ferial cooks in some ways, And I'm trying to figure out how to do that, and I have, this is something I struggle with too. And I think what I do is I box her Misty, or I box her somebody else and say, okay, here's my struggle. This is where I'm doubting myself. And, I get that kind of feedback that, yeah, this is a good plan. This is a good idea. But how can we build our skills as a cook when we're not necessarily getting that positive feedback? I don't know about you guys. When I throw dinner on the table every day, people eat it and they're fine, but I don't, and I might get, oh yeah, this is good. But it's not like they're telling me over and over again how wonderful it is. So how can I feel better about
Yeah, we can't look to our children, especially as students, for affirmation.
Yeah.
Yes. Amen.
That's true. But I do think, especially with kids on the older side, some feedback can help us gauge like how it's working. So I'm thinking like when I bring a new recipe into the house, like I make it and I tell them, you're not going to hurt my feelings. I want to know how you like, should this go into our meal rotation or should I never make this again? Like you need to say now, because if I like it, I'm probably going to make it again. But if everybody hates it,
yeah, but that's also food, which people do want all the time. And like one book that one of my students was assigned in 9th grade, that whole year, he didn't seem like he liked it. And he was complaining about that one. And it seemed like what he wasn't putting effort into. And so when the next student came around, I was just in the car with this child. And so I said, well, I don't know if I'll do that one because, it didn't really seem to click with you. Mm-hmm. And so maybe it was not, just wasn't the right book. And he said, oh, that was my favorite book.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's like 2 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That happened to me with Oliver Twist. Actually, I had a child that swore she hated it, found rereading it 2 years later and claims it was her favorite book that from that year. And you would never have known. The type of feedback I was thinking of, though, was like I put something into the schedule and I don't care if they approve of the selection or the subject, but I do care whether or not I assigned so much that I'm just crushing and making them overwhelming. Or I gave them so little at a time that they can't hardly piece it together. Like I've spread it out too far or, so there's too much at one time. There's not like, I'm thinking more like the logistical parts of it. Like we've been working out algebra right now and I don't care.
I thought you were going to say you were working out and I was like, good for you guys.
You had Abby so excited.
You
Tell
had
me
to
more.
bring that up.
Tell me more.
No. So like, I don't care if she likes algebra and she doesn't have the option to not do algebra, but we can talk about, are you spending 3 hours a day on algebra? Because like, that's not my intention. Right? I do not intend for you, someone who never wants to be a math major, especially, to now I'm going to torture you for 3 hours a day. So I mean, there's some types of feedback where it's like, we can be specific with our kids. I'm not asking for your emotional response to the difficulty of this book. Well, and I shouldn't say that, because if it's so difficult that they feel like they don't understand a single page they're reading, then there's also a problem. Like maybe I assigned something they weren't ready for, or I need to be scaffolding a little bit better in advance or something. But I don't think that kind of feedback is helpful until they're more like probably 10 and up. I feel like before that, they don't judge time well. They don't. I mean, you're
never
doing
trust an 11 or 12-year-old.
Well,
agreed.
Yeah, that's true.
13 and up.
13 and up. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
It does help when you get some buy-in too, when they feel like they have input.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, I have another point. He also talked about the difference between dieting, and then he also talked about fasting. He said that a dieter, had no judgment and it was all the wrong things and attitudes. But whereas fasting can be kind of a refreshing. And I think that there are times when we need to take breaks from school. It's not that we're taking a break from doing things and things like that, but it's taking a break so that we can be refreshed and so that when we do eat those ordinary things, that it comes back and is a delight to us, right? It nourishes us in a different way. Dieting is just, he has some great quotes. So
yeah, he does.
Like the eclair.
Yes.
The dieter, however, this is on page 26.
Thank you.
Has lost all criteria for judgment. That eclairs are fattening is his sole piece of information. If he is in a mood to diet, he will pass up the best eclair in the world without even a backward look. And if he is in a mood to eat, he will devour a corner bakery, cardboard and cornstarch monstrosity as if it were something out of France.
Okay, we're laughing because there's a word there that we do not find pronounceable.
He is a man who, for all practical purposes, has lost his taste. He will choose tough steak in the presence of elegant stew and canned string beans when he might have had dined on mashed parsnips drenched in butter.
Do you think that is the dieting metaphor sometimes how we, give the advice? And sometimes it is valid. Like sometimes we do need to cut back on things and that's, maybe for health reasons or anything like that. There is legitimate reasons for
or
this.
Especially if where you're at is the festival level all the time.
Festival
right?
as
You
well.
can cut back to ordinary.
That's a good point.
But not cutting
back to a deficit, right? Where you are not feeding or nourishing, right? Because that's what a diet is you are putting yourself in a caloric deficit. You have to be real careful because dieters will actually start starving themselves. So are we starving our students when we cut back so much? We want them to have healthy, nutritious food. We don't want them to overindulge all the time, right? We don't need to have them entertained all the time by our lessons, but we also do not want to starve them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think you're right. That was one of my concerns about the whole minimalism movement too. It's the same kind of thing. And I mean this in a curricular sort of sense and that kind of thing.
Do the bare minimum.
Well, if you think about what he's saying about dieting is that you've completely lost your relationship with food. And now you don't have any criteria to judge what is meritorious about the food. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that same mentality, when I start to view everything through the lens, so what would be equivalent to calorie counting? My own convenience, my child's response. I mean, even the lack of peace in my home, even though I understand that that's valuable. I mean, none of us would ever say that's not valuable with Scholé. If there's not peace in the home, you're not going to reach that point of rest. But if we're not careful, we lose that ability to identify the merit of the thing. When I'm cutting things back, I mean, yes, there are the limits. So are we in ordinary time or did I just completely bloat us into a feast that was inappropriate? So that's the one side of it. But then the other side is, am I ignoring merit because this situation is inconvenient for me and I don't want to deal with because the real issue might be that my kid has a terrible attitude. Mm-hmm. And so it's convenient for me to put him on a diet so I don't have to deal with his bad attitude. Mm-hmm. Well, I may have gotten a more peaceful home at the expense of my child's character. Yeah. Because now I'm not dealing with the issue. He's not going to be any easier to deal with when he's 16, 17 years old. And I didn't deal with it when he was 9 or 10. Or even my own attitude towards it, right?
That's true. Yeah,
that's true.
If I just don't want to deal with that person, it's actually more a reflection on me. My job is to parent this child who obviously needs more of my time and attention.
That's true.
There is things like that.
I remember feeling very convicted reading a passage from Charlotte Mason where she basically went after parents who were making decisions for their own convenience, making rules that were completely unreasonable because they didn't want to be bothered by their children. And I'm very tempted to do that. I would like everything.
I want y'all to just stop stepping on my toes today.
I just fell all over my own toes because I just really there is this sense of I don't want to expend the energy to deal with that. Right. And if there's a way to get rid of it that is most convenient for me, that's the tempting road to go down.
Yeah.
But if we're not careful, then you're right. The equivalent is a calorie deficit. And then especially when we're talking about kids.
Yeah.
Dieting for kids is way more dangerous than it is for adults, even though long-term it can be dangerous for adults. Yeah. And I think the same thing is true. They don't ever get to make that up. The stories that they missed in childhood, it's amazing to read the things we missed in childhood. And I've been glad to do it. But so many times when I've read a book I missed in childhood, I'm like, man, I wish I had read this as a child. Because it would have been more magical. It's not, the magic is not there when you're 45 reading something for the first time. Not that I know what 45 is like.
I have 2 points. Spoken from somebody who does know what 45 is like. And my first point is, I just want to point out, yes, what you said, everything. Minimum viable day, though, is totally necessary sometimes at some points in your life. And there should be no guilt around the days that you have to do that.
But even you say it's a minimum viable day, right? We put these in here, and you're
still doing the significant thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there is such a thing as legitimate survival mode.
Absolutely.
Right. It takes wisdom and self-examination to figure out if you need to be in survival mode or not.
Yeah.
And if it's time to get out of survival mode, it can be hard to know.
Well, and then second point,
yes.
Carrying this analogy out even further, not only is there, well, I'm going to diet and eat carrots all the time, but there's also, I'm going to diet and eat fake food.
Yes.
Right.
And so if we're going to carry this on through, I think there's a lot of stuff that we consume.
Twaddle, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that the thing? Like a steady diet of books that are not life
screen. Like
or
lots
living
of
books?
times the move is the kids are bothering me. Let's give them a screen. It entertains them. It's educational.
And it's educational.
So I'm going to feel better about it.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. That's not carrot sticks. That is more like the hot dogs that I serve on Tuesday night.
Wait, we have hot dogs. We have pizza night.
I don't know. Maybe it's protein powder.
right now.
Yeah.
Don't touch my collagen.
Things disguised as,
Right. I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
Plus, what he says here is that dieters lose their relationship to food and eating because they're looking at the wrong thing. And so there are a lot of different ways to look at the wrong thing.
Yeah.
But if it's like the corollary to calorie counting can be checking boxes or, whatever the curriculum getting the grade,
filling out the worksheet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
These external measures that look good on paper and someone else has promised, if you keep within these numbers, good things will happen.
Right.
But it's not actually connected to the good that food and eating and fellowship. There's so much more to eating.
Yeah.
That matters more.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, what he's talking about here is it's okay to trust the old ways.
Yeah.
So just like with cooking, you basically had normal ingredients, things that you can pronounce that grow out of the ground, come from an animal, basic normal ingredients, and a good cook organizing the meal. And then you eat, you digest on your own without anybody helping you, and you enjoy table fellowship as part of that process. And the whole thing is nourishing, including the table fellowship part. Educationally, because we're told you need this video and you need this project and you need this thing, but you look back at how education was done and how most great men were educated, and they had good books, competent teachers setting out their assignments for reading those good books and getting through those good books, and table fellowship and time to digest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And other things in the schedule that would increase their appetite, like exercise. You know what I mean? Because it's not like all day should be school. So, really, if he gives us confidence in anything, it's that what was good for our great-great-grandparents is probably...
It still works.
It still works. Yeah. Maybe that's the biggest application.
In the previous chapter, he has a great quote on the act of cooking, and it's on page 7, and it's at the bottom of the page. Technique must be acquired, and with technique, a love of the very process of cooking. No artist can work simply for results. He must also like the work of getting them.
I highlighted that one too.
Yeah, I just think that, yes, there are going to be really great days in homeschooling, and yes, there's going to be some ordinary days, but liking what we are doing really does matter as teachers. And finding that maybe it isn't because it's maybe our techniques that need to be improved upon so that we can enjoy the process more, because it does take work to do things that you don't necessarily love, right? If you don't love math, how can you order your affections so that you love math rightly, right? Mm-hmm. And have a good attitude about this. Children that don't like things, it's usually oftentimes a reflection of some of the things in our own, maybe not in the same subjects, but in different areas of our lives.
That I get to be a picky eater.
Yes.
Because mom's a picky eater.
Yeah. And it's not that there isn't a lot of drudgery in any art. But if a man has never been pleasantly surprised at the way custard sets or flour thickens, there's not much hope of making a cook of him. And then you skip a little bit and he says, interest in results never conquers boredom with process.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking to the mom who is bored with the process in some way. And let's put some limitations on her. She can't just go hire a tutor.
Mm-hmm.
So what is she supposed to do?
Pick better books.
Okay.
Like living books. I mean, oftentimes when I'm bored with something.
But let's say she tells you what the book is and you're like, that's a great book. Because this has happened to me where I thought it was the book and it wasn't. And so then what are you supposed to say?
Well, I was always a person who was not a math person and all of that. And one of the things that sometimes made me a difficult person in Cindy Rollins' comment section
What?
is that I really did not want to admit that there was a deficiency in myself.
Right.
Like I wanted to say I'm allowed to not be that kind of a person.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with me. It's just not the way, I am I'm not really sure what my problem was, but there was definitely a problem.
You were 25.
I was 25. Now you know that the problem was with you.
The problem was my attitude.
Yeah.
And it's not like recognizing that didn't suddenly make me a mathematician or comprehend it, but it did change the way I approached it. Because to say that the problem was in me and not in math or not in the way I was taught or not blaming anything outside of myself, but saying, I just don't have this interest and that is a deficiency in my part, means that whenever I come to math now, I have to let go of a personal grudge.
Yeah.
And recognize that even if I don't see it, there is beauty. There is objectively, in reality, beauty and truth and goodness and interest there. Even if I don't have it, it's there. And so maybe sticking with it, I can open up the door to interest, and it might take time, but it's possible. And I think that was part of what I had a hard time with when I was younger, is that I didn't actually think it was possible. Mm. And so I didn't want to say it was my problem would mean like I was permanently stuck in this problem because I didn't actually think it was fixable.
I felt that way in preparing for the retreat because Pam was going to teach this memory palace thing. And I don't even want to say it's lack of love or desire. It's fear. Mm. Which he talks about being driven by fear here, like with the calories, that you're afraid of the calories. And I underlined it. A conscience formed by considerations of excellence, not by fear of ghosts. And I think my fear with the memory palace is that I am so far from thinking that way that I won't be able to do it. Underlying it all, that is my fear. And I wonder sometimes if with books, that's the same kind of thing. I don't like this. I don't like it's because it's hard. And if I admit that it's a deficiency in me, what if I can't do it? What if I can't cut it? What if I can't learn to read this book? What if it's too hard for me? The nice part about homeschooling is you're never doing like astrophysics. Because I am a firm believer that there are certain things that we can't learn. I don't have a high enough caliber of brain to understand what the man with the PhD in physics at church is talking about.
Fractions might sometimes come close, though.
I think this is a good point. Abby was saying, what do you do if, like, the book is good, you really don't like the book? Find an easier book. Like, find a book that still shows beauty and you can back up a level. Yeah. And you don't have to start by biting off astrophysics and trying to chew it, back up a few levels and find something that you can enjoy. And then if your child is beyond you at that point, I mean, we're back to the tutor again. My tutor's very affordable. But, that was one of the reasons why I didn't have a child who needed a tutor. Mm-hmm. I had one who needed a tutor, but I had another who didn't. And it's like, well, why are you having that child go to a math tutor? So they can have a conversation about math with somebody who loves math.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that I haven't tried to appreciate math. I've just backed off to where I could enjoy it, So Life of Fred is great for me.
I'm thinking also that is the valuable for people who start out from the beginning in keeping up with their kids and reading the books as they're going. Because most curricula are not just randomly assigning a book in 9th grade. They've worked up to the ability to read that book. So that's where curriculum hopping can hurt us. That's where, so many different
I was also never able to keep up with my oldest. Because when you have the oldest, then there are also babies and toddlers and things going on. Yes. So it's like you can't keep up with the oldest. But then by the time I was doing fractions with my 3rd child, and she would have a question, I would start back at the very beginning to like, what is a fraction? Mm-hmm. And she got so tired of it. She was like, not again. Like, okay, well, let's start with, what is a fraction? The answer is it's a division problem. But part of this was I was actually excited about it because my 3rd time through Math UC, and we won't even count Saxon when I was a kid, it was like it clicked.
Yeah.
And I was 30.
Yeah.
And it was my 3rd kid, 3rd time through. And I'm like, oh, that's why you can just, like, I just learned the trick to get the right answer.
Right.
And on the 3rd time through with Math UC, I was like, oh, now I like understand what's happening. And that's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just got to wait till you're 30 and it's your 3rd time through.
Well, and that just proves the point that all learning doesn't stop at 18.
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah.
And just because your child can do it independently, it's really nice to share a meal with them. And I know that one of my kids really loves sitting next to me and doing math and asking me questions to double check if he's doing it right. And so that kid gets my time and we've been watching the Math UC videos together. And for him, it makes it so much better. And his attitude is better on it is if I'm just there for him. And he's doing great in math. And he's very, he wanted to get ahead of other siblings. And so he is working very hard, but he does want to be able to be reassured. And so we have a math meal almost every day together.
Yeah. It's funny. Andrew Pudewa talks about not, you can never give your child too much help with writing. Like if you're providing a word for them, if you're helping them, write a sentence, if you're giving them an idea or something, you cannot give them too much help because you're modeling and working with them and things like that. They're seeing the process as they're sitting with you. And I had Denise Gaskins on the podcast not too long ago, and she said the same thing about math. She's like, sit and do the math with your child. You work the problem. Let them watch you work it. She said, you cannot give your child too much help when it comes to math. And we have this idea in our head that, if I tell them the answer, they aren't really getting the answer. But the process of learning is all about watching somebody else doing it and, then picking up how you do it yourself.
Well, as long as they are paying attention to what you're doing. Because some of mine would definitely get me to just do it for them.
Right.
They're not actually engaged.
Yeah, but that's a character problem. Sorry.
Come to think of it, I think my favorite math teachers in high school, so I had a geometry teacher and an algebra 2 teacher that were both, in my opinion, excellent. And both of them, it was watching them work lots of problems and proofs on the overhead projector over and over and over. And them basically narrating what they were doing while they were doing it. Mm-hmm. So I put this here for this reason, and I do this thing. And I mean, my favorite one, he had different colored pens. Mm-hmm. So he was color coding the different steps so that step 1 was all in black, but step 2 was in blue. And so that you could actually kind of follow where he had gone. And that really was irreplaceable. I was not intuitive. I was good at math, but I wasn't intuitive about it. I couldn't figure out how to get the answer on my own. I had to have him model it, and then I could apply it to other problems.
That's kind of the way I do sentence diagramming in grammar. Mm-hmm. When you're just together diagramming a sentence and talking through it, that's how we practice grammar. It's just by modeling, looking at a sentence and figuring out what is it saying. Mm-hmm. What's the verb? Well, if that's the verb, then that can't be the subject if that's the verb. Just kind of problem solving through the sentence. And what's that prepositional phrase actually modifying? Mm-hmm. And so we pull out sentences from real books, even though sometimes we do end up with one that can't be diagrammed or one that's just too complicated. This isn't going to be helpful because it's...
Yeah. You've been reading Dickens?
Right.
It won't all fit on the board.
I need a bigger whiteboard.
Seriously.
You learn better from working through those sorts of sentences than the ones that come pre-written just for learning one concept in a grammar book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, or looking at the solutions in the back of the book, which I do appreciate Matthew C because they do show you the steps. They don't just show you the solutions.
Yes.
But I have been really working on my own math skills with this child because I'm actually trying to work through it with him and think through it. Because when you are actually doing math, it makes you a better thinker. So putting myself in the posture of a student is really important. And then we do use the solutions manual if we can't figure it out. And that's okay.
Right.
And it's good for him to see that too, right? Actually, so we might need some help on this one, you know?
Yeah.
So
I was just thinking about the table fellowship parallel to that too. When you're showing them, they're there watching it and about you're talking through it together. I remember reading a paper one time about how a peaceful, engaging dinner table, when they do blood work, people actually get more nutrition out of their food. Like you actually digest your food better when you're in that. It's just this peaceful thing. So like if you have a fight with your family right before you eat, your ability to digest your food and get nutrient out goes way down. And the opposite is also true. When you pray before you eat, like all those different things set you up for being more nourished by the same meal. And I'm thinking, I wonder if it's like that too with our education. Like as you're engaging in that table fellowship together, your resistance is kind of down because you're having a healthy conversation with your mom or with your teacher or whatever. If all of that like makes you get more out of the same lesson.
That's why you should start your day with morning time.
agreed. Not with math with a 13-year-old. That is the wrong time to start it. It's really much better after lunch.
The math people just got their feelings hurt.
I know.
It's okay. I hurt their feelings a few years ago with that one.
They're like, no, we should do it first.
My 13-year-old does not agree.
I'll just give my final thought. Morning time is the perfect. It's ferial at its best.
Yes, it is.
It really is.
It doesn't have to be fancy.
It doesn't
just
have
has
to be fancy.
every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, here's my parting quote for us. Few cooks realize how long it takes to brown meat thoroughly. I don't mean that as a joke. I actually we want fruit right now.
Mm-hmm.
We want to see it. We want to feel validated.
It's not working yet.
Right. And I taught this lesson, but like you were saying, that book, 2 years later, you found out was the favorite book. Mm-hmm. But you never felt like that in the middle. And he goes on and he's like, it's going to take 15 minutes or so to do a good job of browning the meat. You need to slow down and be patient if you want to brown your meat correctly. And we're in a hurry. We're in a hurry to feel better about the situation. But just like you plant, I live where almonds are grown. If you plant an almond, like a little tiny almond tree, it's 7 years to production. You tend that orchard for 7 years before you get a viable crop off of it. But the farmers know that. They know it takes that long. So when they plant the tree, it's a promise to the whole community that they're going to take care of this for 7 years. And they're going to patiently do everything, they're going to tend the whole time. They're going to attend to it, knowing that eventually fruit comes. And I think we just forget. It's not actually ours to take a 5-year-old and demand fruit for next year. I mean, we will see little buds and blossoms along the way, but I think the fruit of our education actually shows up in adulthood. Mm. And I mean, yeah, it's a real blessing when we see promising things. But this idea that we should be demanding outcomes to make us feel better, I think we're just forgetting it takes a long time to brown the meat. Mm-hmm. Which maybe gets back to your point a lot of time that you make. It's our job to be faithful. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what we should worry about, how we feel about. Are we feeling convicted for being unfaithful? Or were we faithful? And then that if we were, that's good and that's good enough.
And they'll appreciate it when they're 30.
You'll thank me when you're 30.
Yeah.
Or maybe they'll be 30 going the third time through Mass, and that's when it's going to click.
Yeah. Whereas I tell my kids, at least you have something interesting to talk about during therapy. On that note, thanks for an interesting conversation, ladies.
I loved
Thank
it.
you.
That's it for today. And that's not just it for today, that's it for season 16. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our next season. We think you're really going to enjoy it. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolasisters.com/SS99 to check it out. While we're on break, don't you think it's time you headed over to the Sistership to see what all the ruckus is about? Or go visit it again if it's been a while since you've been there? We look forward to you joining the conversation. And just go to scolasisters.com/sistership and sign up. Our next episode will be a bit celebratory because it's our 100th episode. We are preparing something extra special. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
Bleh.
Have you heard of a great phonics program called Teaching Reading with Moms?
Collective
Am I going to
gasp.
get
Say it, and then I'll give out your email address.